And here is where most history books stop, though it is far from the whole story. The details of Hamilton's funding program were brilliant, and what ultimately established American public credit, or its ability to borrow again in the future from sources foreign and domestic, to do nice little things, like double the size of the country, fight and win a second war for independence, defeat Mexicans angry over the annexation of Texas, and win a long, bloody war between the states that ended slavery. Well, kind of sort of ended slavery, but that's another story. With the possible exception of Texas, all of those sound like blessings to me. Just kidding, don't mess with Texas. As previously noted, markets for government IOUs existed throughout the 1780s, but most were rather thin and hence inefficient, by which I mean costly and time-consuming. Literally scores of different types of IOUs were extant, and not even brokers knew the details of each. Not even brokers. Under Hamilton's plan, holders of the IOUs traded them in for just 3 types of registered government bonds, called 3s, 6s, and deferreds. Registered meant that the government tracked each owner of the bond by name and location, a fact that will help me make another point a little bit later. 3s were so called because the government paid on them 3% interest annually, or 0.75% quarterly to be precise. They were redeemable at the pleasure of the government, which meant, in effect, after the other bonds had been paid off, because who in their right mind is going to pay off a 3% debt when they have a 6% debt that's still outstanding, right? The government paid 6% annually, or 1.5% quarterly on 6s, and retained the option to redeem up to 2% of the principal annually. This is a brilliant feature that allowed the federal government to slowly repay the principal due on the bonds when it had adequate resources to do so, because it was an option, it wasn't an obligation. Deferreds were so called because the government deferred paying interest on them until the end of the year 1800, when they converted into 6s. So in a sense, they were zero coupon bonds, but they were convertible on maturity, not into cash, but into 6% bonds. The market price of deferreds slowly rose towards that of 6s as maturity came ever closer. When a holder of Revolutionary War debt redeemed their IOUs, most of which had promised 6% interest, they voluntarily received a combination of 6s, deferreds, and 3s that yielded about 4% total. A few of the holders thought that that was a bad deal and held off, but most preferred a more or less certain 4% over the possibility of one day receiving 6%. Hamilton's bonds were fully funded, or in other words, backed by taxes and pledges, while the wartime IOUs were not. In addition, a liquid market for Hamilton's bonds formed immediately. That means that holders could sell their bonds to other investors at fair market prices quickly and at minimal brokerage expense. Holders of Revolutionary War IOUs might not be able to find a buyer at all, or they might have been offered a low-ball price. A holder of a 3 it's okay. A holder of a 3, by contrast, could see the going rate published in the local newspaper and contract with a broker to sell it in a day or two for a 0.5% commission or less. Or the holder could sell it immediately to a dealer for $1 or less than the price listed in the paper. Debt pessimists complained that Hamilton's debt would be perpetual because 3s were payable at pleasure and 6s had no definitive repayment schedule. They were simply wrong about that, as the national debt was entirely repaid during Andrew Jackson's presidency. There was no way that Hamilton or anyone else could know that in the 1790s, but clearly what Hamilton wanted was repayment flexibility. He wanted the government to repay its obligations when it was best able to do so, not according to some rigid schedule that might coincide with a war, a natural disaster, or an opportunity to buy additional territory. The opportunity cost of the national debt, Hamilton argued, was low because his bonds did not lay idle, like so many full-bodied gold and silver coins did, in vaults and chests. Rather, federal bonds were often used to collateralize bank loans and to make large payments. Indeed, millions of dollars changed hands each year at a time when $1 million was, $1 million. And thousands of separate transactions. Hamilton's bonds were, in other words, near money instruments that did not crowd out private investment to a considerable degree and that served a unique role in the portfolios of banks and other businesses as secondary reserves, or reserves that paid interest but could be quickly turned into cash when needed. After federal bonds had been extinguished in the 1830s, state bonds were demanded to fill those same roles, but they never did quite so well as Hamilton's 3s, 6s, and deferreds had. The next line in Hamilton's April 1780 letter to Robert Morris on the national debt explained that the debt, quote, will be powerful cement of our union, unquote. By that, Hamilton meant that one of the debt's blessings would be political rather than economic. By making the federal government the creditor of people throughout the nation, the national debt would create political sentiments in favor of the Union as bondholders protected their vested interests in the health of the national government. Debt pessimists, including many historians with anti-Hamiltonian views, assumed and claimed that Hamilton's bonds were owned only by a relatively small number of rich urban elites. I showed otherwise in One Nation Under Debt by using extant federal bond registers to show that tens of thousands of Americans throughout the Union own federal bonds at some point. I devoted an entire chapter to bondholders in Virginia, the home state of great debt pessimists like Thomas Jefferson. Many federal bondholders in Virginia owned plantations and slaves. Others were professional doctors and lawyers. Others were urban artisans and retailers. And some were women. Abigail Adams wasn't the only female trading government securities, Woody? Oh, Woody's not here. Okay. Some bondholders lived in what is now called Nova, by what would become the nation's capital. Others lived south side, others on the Blue Ridge, others in the Valley, and others along the James, in Richmond and beyond. We'll never know with certainty what influence those bondholders had on public opinion in Virginia, but the fact that federal bondholders were spread across the state, both geographically, right, and occupationally, suggests that they could well have cemented the Union. And one federal bondholder, a chap by the name of Charles Dabney, was a bona fide Revolutionary War hero who had raised his own legion in defiance of the king's tyranny. He owned a huge musket called Dabney and generally was considered what we would today call a badass. I doubt not that Dabney would have rode on Richmond, Dabney in hand, charged and primed, if the government there had threatened secession during his lifetime. In addition to establishing public credit, keeping the Union intact, and providing investors with liquid, low-risk assets, Hamilton's funding system kept total taxes to reasonable levels. State taxes all but disappeared for over a decade, and federal taxes came mostly in the form of tariff and tonnage duties, both of which were relatively cheaply collected and less distortionary than real estate taxes, or income taxes, yes. Of course, all taxes create some distortions. The infamous tax on whiskey that led to the Whiskey Rebellion was needed to offset the effects of the tariff on imported spirituous liquors. which were about 15% or so, and so offered some protection to domestic liquor producers. So Hamilton had to offset it so that he wasn't encouraging the production of whiskey in the U.S. Now, if it sounds odd to you that Alexander Hamilton counteracted a protective tariff, that is probably because you have the wrong idea about Hamilton's views on protection. Dick Silla's illustrated biography of Hamilton, which I'm sure is around here someplace, will set you straight on that notion. Hamilton needed those revenues in order to service the national debt. So he could not raise and did not want to raise, for very solid economic reasons, the tariff structure.